It's a great pleasure to introduce Ed to everyone in this meeting. I've known Ed a long time. One of the greatest compliments I can pay any fellow academic is that when I learn something from them, and I'd have to say that virtually every time I have a conversation with Ed Vogel, I learn something I didn't know before. We've been funded for a long time by the same group at Office of Naval Research, and I always look forward to those annual meetings because Ed's presentation, as you will see momentarily, he just does a great presentation, a great talk. He's just one of the sharpest young scholars in the field today in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. Ed, as I recall, grew up in the Southeast. Did you, Ed? Did you grow up in Florida?
That's right,
and
Miami.
Went to the University of Puget Sound, so flew across the country. Ended up getting his PhD with Steve Luck at Iowa, another great scholar. And several years ago, he and his lab partner, Ed O, everybody refers to them as the two Eds, moved to the University of Chicago. Ed is just a great scholar, as I said. If you look at the stats, he's had 28,000 citations, an H factor of 60 plus. But, I think he really, as I said, I learn something from Ed every time I hear him talk, every time I talk to him. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce a genuinely good guy and a great scholar, Ed Vogel.
Well, thank you so much for that. Very generous, probably too generous introduction, but I'll take it. It's a real honor to be here. There are lots of great people there at Georgia Tech. I really wish, I could be there in person maybe next year. But definitely thank you for having me out virtually here from my home office. So what I'll do today is I'm going to talk a bit about, work we've been doing in the lab for, a number of years, where we're interested in understanding neural mechanisms that underlie visual working memory. And the way I'll sort of organize my talk today is I'll talk sort of briefly about sort of the construct of working memory and why it's useful and why we're interested in it, and then go into some of the neural mechanisms that we've been studying for many years, particularly from a sort of more univariate sort of approach using traditional EEG and ERP methods. But then for each one of those, we've sort of been in the last many years sort of pushing those forward into more multivariate machine learning types of approaches to understand and decode more aspects of working memory activity and dissociating different types of states of activity. And if there's time at the end, if I don't go on too long with that stuff, I'll talk a bit about how we've used some of our approaches to dissociate between different mechanisms and what they're useful for in terms of sort of operating working memory, particularly in dealing with a distraction. So where I'll first start off is talk a little bit about work that I did back when I was in grad school with Steve Luck, where we were working on, asking questions about, well, how much information can we hold in visual working memory? So our ability to sort of temporarily hold information that we see from the environment. We use this, use a simple task we refer to as a change detection task. We can show people arrays of simple objects. Can you guys see my pointer like when I do this? Or is that visible? Nope, I guess not. Okay, then I won't do it. So you see we present subjects with brief arrays of colored squares or other simple objects for a short period of time, take them away for about a second or so, and then we show them one object at the position of one of the original items, and we ask the subjects, okay, is this the same color as what was there originally? So in this example, the purple item originally was yellow, and the subjects just simply have to say, is it the same or different as the color that was there before? And what you can do is you can measure working memory capacity by simply varying how many items are in that original memory display. And what we can find is that, it's a way of sort of determining the capacity. At what point in time or what sort of set size can the subject no longer detect these sort of large categorical color changes? So what I'm showing you here is an average, is a histogram of about 3,800 subjects performing tasks just like what I showed you, where we're estimating the subject's average working memory capacity. And what you can see is that on average, it's somewhere right around 3 or so, which is surprisingly small, at least we were particularly surprised back then, given how simple the displays are. But it's a really stable measure that we can see in lots and lots of different populations. So the average is somewhere around a little bit less than 3. But as you can see from this distribution, there really are like substantial individual differences. Some people have a really low capacity, around 1.5 to 2. Others have a bit higher capacity. And this is a really stable trait. I won't go into all the details of what we've done over the years looking at the reliability and stability of this, but it's a really stable trait of the individual. I think it closely maps onto a lot of the constructs that Randy has been pioneering over the last many decades. And one reason why we're very interested in this is that these individual differences in working memory capacity we can measure with this simple task, like strongly correlate with performance on a wide variety of other types of cognitive performance measures. So what I'm showing you here is a correlation from a different study measuring working memory capacity with this color square change detection task. That's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, it's a measure of overall cognitive ability. It's measured by this thing called the matrix task. It was developed by NIH. It's a 4 or 5 hour battery of a wide variety of cognitive tasks. There's language tasks, there's categorization tasks, attention, memory, decision making, etc. They create this aggregate score that over the course of several hours of all these different tasks. And what I'm showing you here is the correlation between that large battery of tasks and a 15-minute color square change detection task like I was just showing you. So the point here I want to sort of make is that with a simple task like this, we can capture something that's really sort of fundamental about overall cognitive ability in individuals that we can sort of measure as kind of a quick cognitive snapshot of the overall cognitive functioning. So we've been really interested in understanding more about exactly what it is that's sort of driving working memory. In particular, what I'll focus on today is the question of the neural activity that you can measure, particularly with human EEG, to be able to read out different aspects of working memory function. So, but where I'll begin is sort of the early days and the initial sort of study of neural activity underlying working memory. And this was all pioneered by Joaquin Fuster back in the early 1970s. And he was doing single unit recordings in awake behaving macaque monkeys while they performed a delayed match to sample task. So it was a pretty simple task in that what they did was they showed the monkeys 2 toys, and they each had a little well under it. And they showed the monkey that they put some food under one of the toys. They put the toy over the well, then they closed the curtain. And while the curtain was closed, they were recording neural activity from prefrontal cells while the monkey is sitting there thinking about where that food was. After a short delay, a couple of seconds, they opened the curtain. The monkey had to reach over and figure out which toy had the food under it so he could get the food. What they found in prefrontal cells was that there was this sustained firing that was above the baseline firing rate of that particular neuron that continued throughout that entire delay period when they're sort of holding that information in working memory. And this was sort of seen as a potential sort of mechanism for working memory. And really, they kind of talked about it as this potential bridge between perception and the response. So you see the stimulus, you see the location, and then it goes away, and then this delay activity is a metric of this bridge of holding that perceptual information in an active state so that when a response can be made, it's able to sort of help to facilitate that. Now, over the years, delay activity has been observed in dozens and dozens and dozens of studies that are much more carefully controlled with different kinds of working memory tasks. In fact, it's not just in prefrontal cortex. You can see this in a wide variety of neural structures within the brain, particularly in macaques. The areas that show the largest preponderance of delay activity, types of cells that show delay activity are prefrontal cortex, intraparietal sulcus, and inferotemporal cortex. Now, what is particularly interesting about this, and what I'm kind of showing you is a slide from one of Earl Miller's studies from about 20 years ago or so, is that this delay activity isn't just simply an across-the-board uniform increase in firing rate. So it's not just that when the monkeys are doing a task, all neurons are just firing more. It actually appears to be something that's much more specific to contributing to the representation that's necessary for performing that task. So in this example, what you see is that you see the sustained delay activity primarily for cells that have the object that it sort of matches its cell selectivity, the preference for that object. So some cells prefer certain types of objects versus other ones, and if that's what the task relevant information is for that item, you see nice large sustained delay activity for the preferred object rather than the non-preferred object, suggesting that it's something that it's not just a uniform increase, but it's really more about something that potentially is contributing to the representation that's necessary for performing that specific task. Now, people have also done this, obviously. I'm sure many of you are well aware that working memory has been studied in a vast number of studies using fMRI with humans. I'm showing you an example of one from Sue Courtney's lab back, a little more than 20 years ago, doing an NBAC task where they see sequences of pictures and they have to remember the most recent one that they saw to look for a match. And during that sort of delay period, when they're sort of holding that, you see a large set of activations, primarily in frontal and parietal areas. So people talk about these frontal parietal networks that are active when a subject is engaged in a sort of an active working memory task. So what I'm showing at the bottom is it's a meta-analysis of about a few hundred subjects that had all performed various NBAC tasks across many different studies. So you see lots and lots of activity that's there. Often what you see is specific regional areas that are, if they're remembering faces or houses, you see certain regions that process those areas more than others. And so you can often see stimulus-specific activity during the delay activity. It's a delay period, suggestive of holding that. It sort of fits with this idea of the bridge model, where you're recruiting the same sensory areas that were involved in perception for holding on to that information over a period of time. Now, so that's all prior work that's looked at delay activity in a couple different ways, specifically focusing on this more stimulus-specific activity, things that are contributing directly to the representation itself. Now, beyond just the sort of holding on to the stimulus, relevant information for the representation, there are other aspects of working memory representations that are critical, and that's something that we've been really sort of interested in examining, and I'll sort of focus on for the rest of my talk. So, really what I'll talk about today, what we do in our lab is we use the EEG with humans. It has lots of, it's not quite as spatially specific as a lot of these other techniques. It's actually quite, coarse in many ways, but it has the advantage of having really fine temporal resolution. It's also just sort of easier to get lots of information and relatively, inexpensively collect lots of subjects. So what we've been focusing on for the last 15 or so years are using the electroencephalogram, particularly to map out and understand and characterize two different signals that appear to sort of represent similar and synchronous information that's not synonymous, like two signals that seem to go together that are part of the working memory representation, but are actually, as we've been learning, are a bit distinct from one another. And I'm going to sort of go through some of the work that we've done to try to dissociate the two. So the first one I'll talk about is work that I did back when I was an assistant professor, and one of the first studies I published from my lab back at the University of Oregon. So we were using a paradigm that was very similar to what I showed you before for the change detection task, except now it's a slight variation on that. So we have subjects, we're measuring their EEG, and we have them fixating. So they're holding central fixation at the center of the screen. And what we do is we show them a change detection task like I showed before, but the one difference is that we ask them to just pay attention to the items on one side or the other side of the screen. So at the beginning of the trial, they'll see an arrow pointing left or right, and that just indicates, well, keep holding your eyes to the center of the screen, but just attend peripherally either on the left or the right. we show them a balanced display. So there's always an equal number of items on the left and right visual field. And they just have to remember the items that were on the cued side that were the arrow pointed to. So in this example, it points to the left, so they'd remember the items on the left side over the course of the retention period until the test came up and they had to say whether those test items were the same colors or different colors as what they saw originally. Now, the reason why we do that is so it allows us to sort of exploit the fact that the visual system primarily is organized in a contralateral fashion. That allows us to look for more mnemonic specific activity with respect to where they were remembering, the items on the screen. So what we could do is look for if they're remembering items on the left, we could look for activity primarily on the right hemisphere, and vice versa if they're remembering items on the right side. And when we do that, we can time lock to the onset of the memory array and record throughout the retention period. And we can look over posterior electrode sites, and what we find is that there is this sustained negative wave over the contralateral hemisphere with respect to the side of the display they were holding, asked to hold items in memory. So they kind of walk you through this graph if you're not familiar with that. That vertical black bar, that's the moment when the stimuli came on the screen. The little red rectangle, that's when the memory items were physically on the screen. So most of the activity you're looking for in this way, looking at this waveform, they're just staring at a blank screen for about a second or so. At the very end, you can see this visual evoked response when the test array comes up. So what you see in purple is the contralateral electrodes with respect to the side of the display. Yeah.
I think we can actually see your cursor. So
oh, you can. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can. It's a little small, but we can see it. So yeah.
Okay, I'll jiggle it around. Sometimes I make it. Okay, so this is the purple line here is the contralateral activity, the contralateral electrodes. The black line are the ipsilateral electrodes. And what you can see is that starting about 200 milliseconds after the onset of the memory items, you see this divergence. You see this like increasing negativity in the contralateral electrodes. Negative is plotted upwards, by the way. With respect to the ipsilateral activity. We refer to this as the contralateral delay activity, in part because it was reminiscent of delay activity that had been seen in monkeys before, but it had a contralateral organization. I've been calling it the CDA over the many years. Now, a cool aspect of the CDA is that, well, first off, you can isolate it simply by doing a subtraction between the two, the contralateral and ipsilateral activity. So you can just isolate just the activity specific to what they're remembering. And the cool thing about that is that the CDA has this one cool property, and that is it's really sensitive to the number of items that you've been asked to remember on that particular trial. So, for example, when this purple line here is when they're asked to just remember one item. The blue line is when they asked to have two items. Red is 3, and then around 4, it doesn't seem to increase that much more. So you see this nice sensitive, like load-sensitive increase in activity, but it seems to reach some asymptote. And you can go further and look at this this is what I'm plotting here is the mean amplitude of the CDA as a function of a wide variety of memory array sizes. What you see is this increasing function from 1 to 2 to 3 items. And then after that, it reaches some limit or some asymptote in the increase in the amplitude. That is, if you give them 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 or even 12 items, amplitude doesn't seem to continue to increase. So, which when we first saw this, we said, hey, well, that's kind of surprising because there's more stuff, they have to try more. But it also fits better when you think about what the average capacity is of working memory. We know that's somewhere around 3 or so items, and this activity seems to sort of cap out right around where that sort of known behavioral limit has been observed. In fact, you can see this. This is the mean capacity here. This red line here is the mean capacity for this particular group, 2.8. And it's right around where this breakpoint is, where we see in the amplitude function. This also, the fact that it reaches asymptote also sort of helps to sort of rule out some alternative hypotheses about what this increasing amplitude is. It's not just simply effort, for example, because 8 items is harder than, say, 3 items or 2 items, yet the amplitude doesn't continue to sort of increase that would be reflective of such increased effort. We've got a whole slew of other experiments where we've done to try to rule out alternative hypotheses, and the number idea sort of really seems to be sort of the one that is still standing. Another cool aspect of this activity is that this function that we see for amplitude is different for each subject depending upon his or her specific working memory capacity. So what I'm showing you here is the change in amplitude of the CDA from 2 items to 4 items as a function of each individual subject's behaviorally derived working memory capacity. Low working memory capacity subjects show a very small increase from 2 to 4, suggestive that 2 is already kind of near their max, whereas the high capacity subjects show a much larger amplitude increase from 2 to 4, suggestive that 2 is well below what their sort of full capacity would be. So the key aspect here is that we can capture these really interesting and important individual differences just by measuring changes in voltage at the scalp while they're performing these tasks. Okay, so that's the CDA. Now, we've been looking at this for many, many years. We've got all sorts of different studies where we've been using this as a useful tool. But I think that there are still some limitations of the technique. And it's kind of hard for me to criticize it because I spent all this time developing it. But really, there are some limitations in that it's really, this univariate measure of working memory. And there's probably, for example, it requires hundreds and hundreds of trials to average together to be able to get this signal from event-related potentials. And so that kind of limits some of the things you can do to sort of test different aspects of sort of theoretical questions with working memory. It also is something that is dependent upon a lateralized representation. That is, we have to have this kind of contrived display where they're always ignoring these items and always focusing on these items. So that adds a sort of an extra element to the task of sort of divided and selective attention. It also kind of constrains like what we can see, in terms of working memory representations. Right now, this technique is blind to any non-lateralized representation. Of course, there are many of them. There's probably the vast majority of aspects of the representation have sort of this non-lateralized, representation. Now, we're only, exclusively looking at things that are contralaterally organized. So we're kind of throwing a lot of the baby out with the bathwater when we use this technique. It's useful, but it's still somewhat limited. So that's kind of motivated us to go further and to try to use other techniques to try to distinguish signals that are similar to this, that give us more flexibility on testing a wider variety of paradigms and of casting a wider net for catching working memory related activity. So one thing we've done is we've in the last several years been using machine learning and different approaches to decode information from raw EEG. So what we did was in this first pass, what I'll show you is that what we just simply had was subjects were performing a working memory task with either 2 items, and this is just on the screen, just without like being lateralized, either 2 items or 6 items. And we asked, okay, well, can we just take in all the information from all the electrodes rather than just sort of a few, pre-specified clusters of items in the posterior cortex? We can take the whole, we can take the activity from the whole scalp and look to see whether we can decode what the current working memory load is for that trial. So we either had 2 or 6 items. We're taking all the electrodes that are across the whole scalp, and we essentially take, we're creating a electrode by time vector. And what we do is we go through and we're using just sort of a traditional hold one out approach. So we can take 2/3 of the data where we're labeling it either as 2 or 6 set size trial. And that's what we train the model based off of that 2/3 of the data. And then we take the 1/3 of the data that we didn't show the model, and we go through and test to see whether we can distinguish between whether it was a 2 item array or a 6 item array during the delay period. So what I'm showing you here is where we're taking a measure of discriminability. How discriminable is it for across a number of different set sizes? So I was showing you 2 versus 6, but we've got a number of different ones we applied to this data set. With this data set, so in the sort of purple zone, that's the discriminability between 1, 2, or 3 item arrays. And the more greenish color is the 4, 6, or 8 item arrays. And what you can see is we've got it divided for encoding the encoding period when they're seeing the items versus the delay period when they're just like when there's nothing on the screen, they're trying to just remember those items. And what you can see is that when it's 1, 2, or 3 items, we can decode like pretty well. We can, the discriminability is pretty good. But when we go from 4 to 6 to 8, like trying to discriminate those 3 very high set sizes, the discriminability is a bit lower. And what we would discover, sort of the way we interpret that is that, well, when you show subjects an array of 8 items, they can't really hold all 8 of them. They can only hold about 3 or so. And so whether it's 4 or 6 or 8, they may be holding a roughly the same amount of information in each of those. And that's why the discriminability is relatively low. And that's consistent across several different experiments. So we can do it both during the encoding period, as well as during the delay period. But one sort of limitation of this particular data set is that, well, what we're seeing here is that we've got different kinds of different physical displays. We've got more items on the screen for higher set sizes and fewer items for lower set sizes. And so in the next experiment, I'll also talk about sort of an approach to be able to handle and sort of rule out those kinds of physical display differences as what's driving this discriminability. Now, one thing I will mention before I sort of move on from this is that what's kind of really surprising and cool about this is that it doesn't appear that we're just simply picking up the CDA signal that we know is already there, right? So, we know that when people do these types of working memory tasks, you get this sort of contralateral activity that's set size dependent, just as I showed you in the previous slides. Now, it turns out that when we go to the whole scalp and we use these machine learning approaches, that it's not just the CDA that's contributing. I'm sure it's contributing to some information to this classifier, but it's not all of it. So, for example, even when we scramble the labels for whether they're attending the left side or the right side, which would completely obliterate the CDA if we did that, this classifier works just as well. So it doesn't seem to care all that much about whether it's on the left side or the right side. It really mostly cares just about how many items are being attended or remembered on that trial. And so it's not just simply sort of we're not just simply reinventing the CDA. Okay, so getting back to this physical stimulus difference question. In this newer study, what we did was we had subjects they came in 2 different sessions and did 2 different experiments. They're very similar to each other, but we had them do, doing different kinds of feature working memory tasks in each of one of them. Now, the key aspect of this design is that there are always 5 items on the screen on all trials. And so the physical stimulation in terms of the items that are coming up are identical across all set size conditions. We just simply vary which ones they had to remember so we can vary the load in a balanced way. So, for example, in this color task, there were always 5 items. 3 of them were squares and 2 of them were gray circles. And the subject's task was just to remember the colors of the squares. That way we can have 5 things always, but we can just simply vary how many squares there were. Likewise, in the orientation task, they came in like about a week later and did the orientation task. There's always 5 of these little screw heads that are there, and the subject's task is to remember the orientation of this central line in it. So it's 1 to 4 orientation. Is there a question, or was that just a... Okay, so there's always 5 items on the screen, and we just varied how many of the orange ones that they had to remember. So we could have 1, 2, 3, or 4, so we could vary the set size while also holding the physical display, at least as best we can, as constant across all the conditions. Cool thing about this is that then it also allows us to ask questions about whether when a subject is holding information about just color, and we're measuring the set size, whether that's the same signal that we're seeing as when they're doing something with a different feature that we measure in a different session. So here's what I'm showing you is the classification accuracy for using this across the whole scalp for decoding whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4 items that they're asked to remember on that trial. On the left side is when they're doing the color classification, or they're doing the color task. You can see that within about 150 milliseconds or so, we can start to classify the load. It really reaches its maximum classification accuracy around 400 milliseconds, but it has sustained throughout the entire retention period. Likewise, when we're classifying orientation, we can classify the load. So just mind you that chance would be at 25% because it's a set size of 4. So which one of these 4 set sizes is it? compared to just simply shuffled labels. So we can see that we get nice significant classification accuracy. Now, what's interesting about this is that we can sort of then, so even though we've got these nice balanced displays and everything, there's always 5 items on the screen, we can figure out how many they're holding in working memory on that file. We can go further and try to, rather than just figuring out, well, which one of the 4 loads is it, we can essentially take the same data and look at pairwise classification accuracy for within these individual experiments. So we have really, really good classification accuracy when we're trying to determine whether it's 1 versus 2 items in memory. Similarly, for 2 versus 3, it's not quite as good, but it's quite pretty good. And performance is still above chance, but considerably lower when we're trying to distinguish between 3 versus 4, which is similar to what we were finding in the previous study, where once we get up around capacity, the differences that, like in what we can distinguish between what the load are is reduced. We think it's because, well, that's because they're probably holding roughly the same amount of information when you get up around capacity. Sometimes subjects can't quite hold all 4 of those items, and so it's not too surprising to us that our classification ability is reduced in those scenarios. Another really cool aspect of this with this work is that we can, because the subjects came in they did 2 different tasks and we had to come in 2 different sessions, what we could do is we could look to see whether we could train on one session and then test our ability to classify load from a different session. So what I'm showing you here in this graph is when they, in the blue line is when we train the model on the color task, like on this day 1. And then what we did was then we tested the model on that same subject's orientation data that we collected about a week or so later. And even though they're different tasks and they're different stimuli, what we find is that whatever signal, sure, there's a little bit of it. There is a hit in terms of overall classification accuracy. It's mostly because we're going across sessions, so the electrodes aren't all exactly in the same position. But it's relatively robust. But what we can find is that whatever signal that we're catching with the orientation, decoding and the color decoding seems to be sort of in common between the 2. So it's not just that it's feature or stimulus specific activity that's measuring changes in load, but it's something that's more general across different types of feature sets. So we can either train on color and test on orientation, or train on orientation or test on color. It doesn't really make much of a difference. We can classify the load in either of those scenarios. So it seems that it's sort of something that's more sort of stimulus general in terms of the load signal that we're observing. Okay, so next part of the talk, I'd like to talk about another signal that we've been observing for a number of years, and this is the alpha signal, and that is activity using sort of looking at oscillatory activity in the 8 to 12 hertz range. Particularly, we think it might be something different from what we've been observing with with working memory load, like the CDA, and then it really looks like it might be a map of prioritized space that you're sort of able to use, in terms of spatial attention, and also involved in working memory. So we've looked at this, in prior work. We're just sort of using traditional univariate measures. We're just simply measuring mean alpha power as a function of set size, for example. And we do see a set size dependent desynchronization or decrease in amplitude of alpha power with increasing set size. It shows a lot of similar properties to the CDA. So you can see that the alpha power decreases for 1 to 2 to 3 items, and then it seems to reach some asymptote somewhere around 3 or 4 items. And likewise, you can look at the sort of the change in alpha, the set size effect in alpha power suppression, and it also correlates with working memory capacity. Now, interestingly, I won't go too deep into it. It seems to be different variants that it's explaining in working memory capacity from what we observe in the CDA. And in fact, if you put both of them in a regression model, you can now explain almost double the variance by having both measures. So it seems to be something that's kind of swimming along with the CDA and sort of captures some aspect of individual differences, but they're somewhat unique from what we're observing with the CDA. Similar to the CDA, you can also, with univariate measures, find that it's got a contralateral organization. So you get this contralateral alpha suppression, both for whether they're just doing a simple spatial attention task where they just simply have to attend some positions waiting for an important stimulus, or when they're doing a working memory task, when they're remembering objects like I've been showing you before. Now you get a little more alpha suppression for remembering the objects, but you get a significant suppression, contralateral suppression of alpha, even when they're just simply attending some empty positions waiting for an important stimulus. So this is a univariate measure of alpha. We've done this in the last like 6 or 7 years, measuring using a more multivariate approach to trying to use topographic distributions of alpha power as a way of decoding where someone is holding attention, covert attention, in somewhere in space. So here's one approach that we've used for this. So here's one task. The subject, it's a simple queued, kind of Posner style queuing paradigm, where what we do is at the beginning of the trial, we give them a little cue, this like little, this little cross that has one bar that's blue. And that blue bar kind of points to a spot where we want the subjects to pay attention to, because that'll be spatially informative for where a briefly presented target is going to appear sometime in the future. So we show them this cue, they wait for about a second, kind of hopefully attending to that spot where we pointed to, and then they see this display. It's a search display of mostly letters, but has one number in it. Very briefly presented. We even titrate it so that people are right around 80% accuracy. So it's relatively brief, then it's masked. And so we do that just so kind of to motivate subjects to really orient their attention in advance so that they can perform the task, because otherwise it's a really difficult task to perform. So what we're really interested in here is during this period when they're waiting for the search array to appear. We're trying to catch their sort of shift of covert attention over to that spot, waiting for that particular stimulus to appear. And so what we're going to do is use an approach to try to decode using alpha power the topographic distributions rather than just the specific univariate locations. The whole topographic distribution to try to model out where attention is based off of alpha power. And to do that, we're using what's referred to as an inverted encoding model. I won't go into too much detail, but the basic idea, this was originally developed by Brouwer and Heeger, where we can measure, like sort of large-scale population-level activity at the scalp. And what we can do is we sort of have what's referred to as, rather than just simple decoding, we can use this encoding idea where we, rather than just having a black box that's just saying, okay, well, how well can it discriminate between this category and this category? What we do is we have a priori expectations about how space may be organized in the brain. And the way we have it, we have a simple basis set model where we have these, propose these simple spatial channels that are tuned to different positions in space. And the basic idea here is that, well, this the coding of this location in space is more similar to, say, a nearby location than it is for a really far, location. So what we can do is we can have position channels for each one of the different 8 spots that we have on the screen. And that sort of our simple assumption is that, well, information that's, at that particular location is going to have the maximal response, and it's going to have a graded function. Things that are nearby will have, less but similar amounts of activity, but things that are far away will have much less activity. And what we can do is we can, through the training, we can have people remembering or attending at positions of all around that whole clock, all those 8 positions. And we can sort of map out, we can train up what the predicted channel responses would be for each of those 8 spots. So, for example, if they're remembering attending this location, we would expect, well, that's channel 2, that should have a maximal response. Channel 1 and 3 that are nearby will have sort of an intermediate response, but things that are much further, like 4, 5, or 6, or 8, will have a sort of negligible response. So that's essentially the modeling idea. Then what we do is we can record the activity of the alpha power for each one of the trials, and we look to see how well that sort of matches those model predictions, and we can then test that. Okay, and then from that we can build what we call a channel tuning function. It's simply a way of sort of try to reconstruct where attention was oriented on the basis of sort of what we've got from this pre-specified model. So when we do that, we get something that looks like this big spaghetti plot. And this is just showing it, in different colors, each of those different spatial channels where we had people attending. And what you'll see is that, if you kind of squint, you can kind of see, like, say, for example, this yellow one has a maximum one at 225, and this orange one has a maximum at 315. It's kind of hard to tell somewhat, so because they all have different origins. So to simplify our plots here, what we do is realign all the data so that they all have a sort of a 0 as the origin, and so it makes it a lot easier for us to see how they sort of line up. Then we can average all those together, and this is how we get what we call a channel tuning function. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is just sort of a graphical representation of the reconstruction of where we use topographic alpha to decode where people are attending during that period when we cued them, had them orient over while they're still holding fixation, when they're waiting for the search array to come on. So we're sort of looking at them shifting attention over, parking it at that spot, waiting for a potential target at that location. So what I've got here in this donut plot here is that this is the reconstruction amplitude. Yellow is the area where we have the highest amplitude of the channel tuning function response. So that would, if we were trying to use a simple decoding approach, that's where we would sort of decode where attention was at that moment. So in this example, the cue was pointing to 3 o'clock on the right, and that's where we see the maximal reconstruction amplitude. But then if we have one that's pointing down to around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, we can see that the reconstruction amplitude is down in that location, similar to for 6 o'clock. This one's about around 7 or 8 o'clock. This one's at, I guess that would be 9 o'clock, et cetera, right? So we can use this as a way of being able to reconstruct to decode where they're covertly attending. So even though their eyes are just pointed at the center of the screen the whole time, we can use this topographic distribution of alpha using this modeling approach to be able to decode where they're attending, even when they're just simply waiting for a stimulus to appear on the screen. Okay. We can also use the slope of this function as a way of sort of measuring the time course of when attention was shifted to a given location when they're sort of performing this particular task. So this arrow right here is the cue onset that pointed, where they need to orient their attention. This arrow here is when the array came on itself. And what we did was we had two different kinds of conditions in this task. One where we gave them an informative cue, as I told you before, it pointed to the spot where the target was actually going to appear. And then we had another condition where it was an uninformative cue, where there wasn't a little blue arm. They were all just the same yellow color. And it didn't tell them, it was sort of what we would call a neutral cue. It didn't tell them any spatially informative information in advance of the display, so they had to wait until the array came on before they could try to find where the number was. And what you find is that, well, what you can see is that, when it's the informative cue, when it gave them information, well, we could decode the position of the target well in advance of the array. So they were orienting their attention somewhere around 200 milliseconds after the cue onset. We could start significantly decoding attention at the correct spot well before they even saw the target. And that sustains all the way through as though they kind of attended there and parked for a while waiting for the target to come on. If it was uninformative, didn't give them any information, well, we couldn't decode the position at all, not surprisingly, but it's nice to check that. But then after the array comes on, about 200 milliseconds after that, they probably find the number, and now we can start to decode the position of attention because that's where the target, once the target came on, the physical stimulation itself allowed them to orient their attention towards it. So we can use this as a way of measuring sort of the timing of attention in this sort of both spatially resolved as well as temporally resolved manner. In the same study, we had a different experiment where rather than using a cue in advance, it was just simple visual search display where they saw a bunch of oriented lines around these sort of 8 positions, and their subject's task was to try to find one target that was either horizontal or vertical amongst a bunch of oblique lines. And what was cool about this was that sometimes when you do tasks like this, sometimes you find the target right away, sometimes it takes a bit longer. And what we did was we were able to divide the trials up on the basis of the reaction time, whether they're fast trials or slow trials. And what we could see is that we could start decoding the position of the target much earlier on trials where they responded more quickly. So if they found it really quickly, well, we were able to find that we could decode that position much earlier than if it took them longer, presumably because they had to search a number of positions before they eventually landed on the target. So there's again another piece of evidence suggesting that we can use this approach to not only decode where they're orienting in space, but also to be able to determine how quickly they can find and orient attention towards a target. Okay. All right. Hopefully I haven't overwhelmed you with speaking really quickly, but it looks like I think this goes for maybe another 14 or 15 minutes, maybe. Not too long? Okay. Well, hopefully I'll go quickly with this last part. It's not too long, where we've used some approaches like this. I'll kind of harken back to the sort of univariate measures of alpha and CDA to ask questions about, well, what the sort of functional relationship is between these two different signals. One that appears to sort of index how many items you're currently holding in memory, or sort of item-based information, versus one that appears to sort of map out spatially prioritized space. It's like, where are you spatially attending at a given moment? And one thing we're interested in, particularly with working memory, is this question of like, well, how do we deal with distraction? Working memory is very small, and there's all sorts of things that might pull attention away from what we're currently trying to perform at any given moment. So what I love about this photo is this is back from the 1920s. This is sort of an approach to sort of dealing with distraction, all the noise back, of working in an office. Now, what's funny about this is that it kind of harkens to modern times where you're like, well, actually, with COVID protocols, this is sort of what people look like in my lab, not quite with the oxygen tank, et cetera, but you get the idea. Sort of has some appeal for other reasons nowadays. Now, how do we deal with distraction in terms of working memory? Well, we're interested in ways of understanding, like, once you have some information in working memory, how can you protect it from being overwritten or sort of wiped out by other like stimulus inputs that are occurring while you're maintaining information in working memory? And in particular, as I've sort of made a point throughout this talk, is that working memory delay activity is not monolithic. It's not just that there's one form of working memory activity. There appears to be at least several different mechanisms that are sort of co-occurring that are providing different aspects of working memory representation for task performance. So in this couple of experiments I'll show you, we're interested in these two different measures of active neural processing. One, the CDA, that we think is an index of item representations, and the other, the lateral alpha power, that's a measure of spatial attention to a given location. So here's this interruption paradigm that we've been using the last several years. It's very similar to the CDA type experiments that I've shown you previously, where they're cued to one side or the other, and they're asked to remember the colors of some items on one, on that side, so that, and perform a change detection task at the end. Is this the same color as what was originally there? So same basic task, but one difference is that on a portion of trials, in the middle of the delay period, we flash up task irrelevant items, colored squares, along the midline of the screen. Okay, the reason why we put them on the midline is that our measures of looking for the CDA and lateral alpha are blind to any activity that's going on in the midline. They're just going to simply tell us what's happening in terms of lateral representation. So we've got, we'll get a measure of how they're attending and representing those items in memory, and then we can look to see what happens to those lateral representations when we interrupt the subject with these task-irrelevant items that come up on the screen. Now, when you do that, not surprisingly, performance goes down. So people take about a half an object's worth of a hit. Sort of, it doesn't completely obliterate performance, but it does actually sort of definitely interfere if you're trying to hold these items. Now you flash up some other items that look kind of similar, but in a different spot. It definitely harms performance. But we're interested in sort of in terms of taking these two measures of working memory and asking, well, what is the impact of those ongoing representations that are critical for performing the main task when you flash up these task irrelevant displays, and do they show like the same kind of response across those two measures? So here I'm showing you here on the left in the two blue lines of what happens when we have no interruption versus interruption. So the light blue line, so I guess to orient you, this is the CDA measure on the left side. This first gray bar here is when the memory rate came on. And for the first 500 milliseconds, they're just remembering those items. They don't know if they're going to be interrupted or not. The second gray bar here is when those midline distractors flash up on the screen. The light blue line is when there's no interruption, and not surprisingly, you get this CDA that sustains throughout the retention period. The dark blue line is the interruption condition where they are remembering the items, and then once the interruption happens here, then what you see is that the CDA appears after, it hangs on for a few hundred milliseconds after the interruption happens, but it really sort of approaches, after about 300 or 400 milliseconds, it starts to decline and wipes out, seems to go down to around 0. It looks like interruption seems to sort of have a significant impact on the CDA in terms of knocking it out, although it does hold on for a few hundred milliseconds, even though attention's probably been pulled away by those distractors. Now, interestingly, when we look at lateralized alpha, we can look at the spatial attention response to this interruption. What you can see is that now, to kind of orient you here, going down means that they're attending laterally. And what you see is for the two interruption and no interruption, you're attending laterally towards those toward the memory items, as we would expect, prior to the distractors. Now, once the distractors come on, when there's interruption, we see that attention seems to go back up to 0. Now, what up to 0 means is that there's no difference between left and right. To us, that means that they're attending centrally. Whereas when they're not interrupted, it just stays lateral, in fact, and continues to sort of grow and increase. Now, what's interesting about this is that they get interrupted, they get pulled to the middle of the screen, but then after a few hundred milliseconds, attention now returns back to the lateral position. So when you interrupt them, they orient their attention towards the center of the screen where those distractors are, and then within a few hundred milliseconds, attention returns back to sort of the original positions of those memory items. So it appears to recover. So it's interesting about this is that the alpha measure of spatial attention and the CDA measure of object representations really do show very different sort of functional patterns in response to distraction. The CDA sort of holds on for a little while and then kind of essentially gets wiped out, whereas the lateralized alpha orients over towards the distractors and then reorients back over to the position of the targets. Now, we're still trying to understand exactly functionally what that means. Like, does that return mean that that's able to sort of regenerate those working memory representations, or maybe it's sort of anticipating where they're going to be tested later on? How critical is that for sort of successful, protection from interference? We don't really know, but that's sort of a direction that we're interested in.
Ed, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About this? It's Randy.
Yeah.
Interesting study, interesting data. What would happen if it were an auditory distraction? I mean, you're calling it spatial attention,
Yeah.
but is it just a distraction, and would it make a difference whether it's some other sensory modality?
That's a great question. We don't know the answer to that. That's actually a study we're getting ready to run. To whether it requires, I mean, my thing, again, it kind of depends on if
Yeah.
it would kind of depend on whether there's also the spatial information and auditory,
Yeah.
whether it's just sort of a global auditory signal, is it just any type of just interruption without spatial information, or whether if it, a spatially lateralized auditory signal. I don't really know the answer to that. My hunch is that, it will probably have a similar impact is my bet,
Yeah.
but I don't
know. The
know.
real question is it domain general? Is it domain specific? And you probably know my
that is absolutely,
guess on that.
That's a great question. I unfortunately don't have a good answer to that.
Good,
I mean, I've seen some work that suggests that in other kinds of domains that suggest that it might be something that's more domain general, those kind of interruptions. But with these specific signals, I don't know the answer to it yet. Okay, last experiment, I promise. Using a similar approach, we're interested in that last experiment. We were asking, what was the fate of the targets that you're holding in memory when you distract them? And so we were just looking at sort of what happens to what you were holding in memory in the first place during an interruption. We can kind of flip the script on that and say, well, what's the fate of these distractors? When those distractors come up, do they get stored in working memory? And so what we can do is we can ask, well, are they suppressed? Are they stored in memory? And one way to do that is by manipulating the task relevance of the distractors, whether they have to do something with the distractors or whether they can just completely disregard them, just like in the last experiment. And so we can also ask about questions about attentional capture and how obligatory it is, particularly different aspects of it. Is it about just the items that are captured, or is it the spatial attention that's captured? So here's the way we did this. We changed the geometry of what we were doing before. Now, in the previous experiments, they were holding items in a lateral hemifield. And so we can look for contralateral signals for, for what they're holding in memory. In this task, we changed that. We had the targets along the midline, so our CDA and lateral alpha analyses would be blind to it. It actually should give you kind of a 0 because it's equivalent between the left and right hemispheres. So we do that so we can be blind to the targets, and then what we do is we take the distractors and we make them lateral. And so that gives us a way of sort of looking at how much processing occurs for those distractors that are coming up later on. They're interrupting working memory. So here's the idea. We give them some working memory items, just 4 items along the midline, and then have to go for a period of time, and then the distractors come up. And on what we do is we have one hemifield of distractors are colored, and the other are just sort of gray that have a similar luminance as the colored ones, so that they're a little more balanced in that way. But the colored ones sort of still capture attention toward that side. And in one condition, we had, one block, the first block, we had them just simply always ignore the interrupting items, just like in the previous experiment. In the second block, we changed the task a little bit and said, okay, hold these items in working memory, these ones along the midline, and then if some items do flash up, we just want you to make a decision about whether those items were circles or squares. So we made it a really simple perceptual discrimination. They don't have to remember the colors. They don't have to do much other than just simply register whether these items that interrupt it were squares or whether they were circles. And they don't even have to respond right away. Just later on, they say it was a circle or square, and then they do their working memory task. And this is a way of sort of manipulating whether they had to sort of potentially have the relevance of whether the distractors were completely irrelevant, they could be ignored altogether, or whether they had to sort of have some minimal amount of processing to make that discrimination. So here's the performance on the task. Interruption always hurts you. If you have to discriminate them, it hurts you even more in terms of your working memory performance for the original items. But question is, what happens to the neural representations? So here I'm showing you the CDA analysis. So again, remember that the targets are on the midline. So prior to the distractors, we expect no CDA at all, and that's what we find. It's a flat line because they're just remembering in the middle, so there's no difference between IPSI and contra. But then after the distractors come on, what you see is that if they're asked to discriminate those items, just simply to say whether or not they're circles or squares, we get a nice, brief CDA. It appears as though they have to temporarily load that information into sort of an active working memory. It only lasts for a few hundred milliseconds. You get a little lingering information. However, if they're asked to ignore those distractors, that CDA is completely gone. So the information doesn't sort of enter, at least from our view, enter into this active working memory state. But interestingly, we do see this one component. I didn't get a chance to really set it up much, but this one component that's been studied for the last several years called the PD. It's a distractor positivity that's related to sort of suppression of irrelevant information. And so it looks like when you're asked to completely ignore, you kind of put the brakes on and kind of suppress the information that may be becoming and interrupting. I'm sure that varies in efficacy across individuals. But what you see is you put the brakes on, you have some suppression, and there's no sort of clear evidence for encoding those items to working memory. But if you have to discriminate them, well, there's no suppression mechanism. You actually let that sort of let that flow into working memory, at least briefly, so you can make that discrimination. So that's one sort of response in terms of when we're looking at these object representations. At the same time, we can look at lateralized alpha, sort of the spatial counterpart that goes along with these item representations. And interestingly, what we find is that very similar to the last experiment, what you see is that, attention was originally at the center. That's why it's at 0. So it's at center, no difference between ipsilateral and contralateral. And then when you have the distractors come up, they go lateral towards the distractors, both whether it was the ignore condition or the discrimination condition. You orient over towards those distractors for a period of time, and then you spatially orient back towards the middle, back where the targets were originally. So it looks as though, from an attentional capture standpoint, what's interesting about this is that spatial attention is captured, whether it's task relevant or irrelevant. Spatial attention seems to obligatorily go towards those distractors and then return back over to your task relevant information in the midline. Whereas item representations that we can map out with the CDA, when you're trying to ignore it, it looks like you could put on some suppression mechanism, and at least it doesn't appear that like that aspect of it is necessarily captured as well. Okay, so I know that was a lot, so I'll just kind of keep my conclusions relatively brief. Working memory capacity is a stable trait of the individual, and we can, I think, best really understand it in terms of how well people can protect working memory from distraction. And I think that that's something that's a critical aspect of attentional control that people like Randy and many others have been arguing for the last like many 20-some years. Working memory delay activity is not monolithic. We always originally thought it was just sort of a perceptual bridge, bridging perception to responses. I think that that's certainly part of the picture, but there are at least a number of other types of mechanisms that seem to sort of have distinct but complementary processes. One that we can measure with the EEG is what appears to be a sort of a map of prioritized space, like where your spatial priority is for attending in space. And another that it seems to index the item representations, at least up to the level of working memory capacity. And these two sort of mechanisms, while they sort of really are synchronized and they co-occur in many situations, we can dissociate them experimentally and as well as a number of different ways. Distraction during maintenance appears to produce distinct dynamics for these two markers of working memory. The CDA initially persists before being reduced, which is interesting because it looks like you can sort of still have some, at least for a few hundred milliseconds, some information about the object that is lingering, even when spatial attention has been sort of withdrawn into another location. At the same time, lateral alpha suggests that you can, orient attention toward the distractors before recovering back over to the target position. So the two measures, while they often really do have similar properties, really have different dynamics following when you do these kinds of distraction tasks. And when you have task-relevant distraction, it seems to sort of produce a more complete disruption of the CDA and results in distractors being briefly stored in working memory. But when it's task irrelevant, you get markers of attentional suppression. Okay, so that was a lot to sort of take in. I'll just briefly thank my lab for doing almost all of this work, and that my research was funded by the NIMH and ONR, as Randy had mentioned before. And thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions as you do.
Wonderful, thank you, Ed. Here's some applause from myself and everybody else. All right, so we're actually a little bit beyond time. So if anybody needs to leave, feel free, but maybe we can just open it for a couple of quick questions. So if you have a question, maybe just unmute and go for it.
Yeah, hi, I had a question. A nice talk. I wanted to ask about, you may have talked about this, I'm sorry if I'm repeating something you already mentioned, but I'm wondering if the algorithms that you use for the decoding, did any of them take into account the ongoing or pre-stimulus EEG signals that would somehow be indicators of brain state, and if those were at all predictors of performance on a trial-by-trial basis?
That's a great question. Yeah, we often will look at the sort of pre-stimulus activity to see whether we can sort of try to map this out. Now, in terms of for the spatial attention one, for alpha, there you actually can get some pre-stimulus activity. So this sort of this baseline activity. The idea is that, subjects aren't just sort of, there's never a point where, at least from our sort of theoretical perspective, people are always attending somewhere to some degree. And the question is whether we can capture some elements of that. It does work. It's much weaker, but you can get some information that's sort of pre-existing there. Now, we can have it in a situation where it's not just simply biasing how our solutions are for once the stimulus comes on itself. We get, there are the different ways for sort of separating that out, or having a sort of longer sort of delay period responses, or even shuffling the labels for the positions as a way of trying to decode, to separate from that. Now, in terms of the number of items, in terms of decoding the load, that all like pre-stimulus, we get no information at all for whether we can do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We've got some other things we've done where we're looking at things like whether the subjects are really attentionally engaged. I didn't talk about this, but that's also something where we can really see pre-stimulus activity, particularly in the theta band. If the subjects are really sort of in a sort of attentive, engaged state, we can tell whether they're going to do well on the trial, or whether they're going to sort of have a attentional failure. That's something that we can see definitely during the pretrial activity as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, and we have a question from Yunwo.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your presentation. That's a great presentation with some excellent materials. My name is Noah, and I'm an undergraduate research assistant. My research interest is human-computer interaction, and especially brain-computer interaction. And as you just said, EEG signals like event-related potentials are really, really useful in EEG data decoding. We've seen prototypes using like P300 to decode selection jobs and help disabled people to type. And like we have SSVEP or ASSR, which essentially is not ERP, but also useful in establishing prototypes that help people can do selection jobs. And with the CDA, which tracks index of items representation, and lateral alpha power, which you just told, which decode index of covert spatial attentions, do you think these techniques or like these signals can be essentially more powerful than previous ones like P300 SSVEP in prototyping brain-machine interfaces that decode people's selection job?
That's a great question. All that stuff is super interesting. I think they have a lot of potential. I think that the P3 is great. It's been around for a long time. It's a little bit there's some clunky aspects of it but I think it does because it requires a lot of trials. You have to do the probabilistic manipulations and things like that. One thing we found I didn't get a chance to go into where I think that there are some real big advantages of some of the techniques that we're using now. Hard for me to really compare them to other ones that are out there, but like for example, our multivariate measure of load, like that are sort of the sort of machine learning version of the CDA. We've been able to find that like we can classify working memory load on single trials. So just raw EEG, one little segment, like once we've trained up the model, we can just show it one segment, one single trial, and do a pretty good job of decoding the load. Especially, we have to go back beyond just simple, linear classifiers using, recurrent neural networks. I think that deep learning kinds of approaches work really well on the single trial, and I think that that's something that has some real advantages. Now, how that stacks up to some of these other techniques, I mean, SSVEP is really cool for decoding, but it's as you probably have experienced, like in our hands, it's always been a tricky technique. You really need to have careful control of these like rapid presentations. And what's nice about having the flickering just at the right frequencies and not having your video card dump out and drop frames and things like that. So it's a simpler technique. You can compared to SSVEP. So yeah, I think I don't know if it was necessarily superior to those other techniques. It's hard to really evaluate that. But what I could say is that I think that for a BCI types of applications, both alpha decoding and also this item limit decoding could be like very useful for those kinds of applications. Specifically because they provide really specific but unique types of information, like knowing where someone is spatially attending in a field and doing that in a relatively rapid manner, I think is really quite advantageous. P3 BCI types of applications, like for example, they'll try to have someone kind of typing with their mind by flickering letters on a key on an alphabet. And having like a probability manipulation of where the flashes are, like that. At least that my naive or knowledge of that literature. It's kind of a cumbersome technique. It works, but I think if you have something that could get spatially and temporally resolved information about where someone was attending, in a given part of the visual field, I think that could really be exploited from an engineering standpoint. And I think that could be a really exciting avenue to explore with us.
That's some exciting news. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dobie, I think you're talking, but you're muted.
Oh, Dobie, you're muted.
All right, amazing. I was talking for a while. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying that you have a meeting with the graduate students pretty much starting right now. And so this is probably a good time to end this. Thank you so much for the talk again. This was really informative. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll talk to you later. So I'll be
Fantastic.
again. So thank you
Great.
again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, bye.